Welcome to Right On Audio. We hope you enjoy this feature presentation. All Right On Audio presentations are protected by copyright and are the exclusive property of Right On ePublishing, LLC. If you enjoy this presentation, please like, share, and subscribe to receive notifications of all our latest content. This presentation is intended for mature audiences. Discretion is advised. Now please enjoy this Right On Audio feature presentation. Right On Audio presents In the Light of Day, a Right On Press feature. Caleb Rellie and his wife Nancy, whom he fondly called Kick, went out for a date night, as they attempted to do every Friday night. Although a priority, as of late, they had not really found the time or money to make it happen. Usually Nancy would peruse the local newspapers for discounts. On this particular night, they found none. But Caleb decided they should go out anyway and eat at a restaurant they had never tried before, DiMaggio's. It was a newer Italian restaurant that had opened. Caleb was on the brink of good news and planned to live it up by ordering one of their better wines. Normally, Caleb would not drink and drive. However, he felt one glass wouldn't hurt him, especially if they made sure to linger before they left. His day had been filled with efforts to merge another company with his employers. One set of contracts were left to be signed and the deal was done. All he needed to do was make sure everything was signed in time for next Monday's business meeting. This was a cause for celebration. The bottle of Shiraz from South Africa, which he found ironic considering it was an Italian restaurant, seemed to suit the occasion nicely. He knew that with every sip, the stress of the day would melt away, and he could concentrate on enjoying the evening with his lovely wife. "It's a bit dry in its aftertaste," lamented Nancy. "Yeah, a bit, but it will do the trick," mumbled Caleb as he tipped the last of the bottle over. He waved his hand to call over the waiter. "Check, please." He never even hesitated as he signed the overpriced bill for the meal that he soon wouldn't even remember he had eaten. There was hardly a car on the road when they left the restaurant to head for home. It had been dark and the pavement was wet from the brief rain during dinner. When the semi-truck lost control, its brakes locked and it swerved around the corner, Caleb felt his senses spring to alertness as he attempted to avoid it. He heard the tires squeal as he pushed on the brakes, and he felt the glass from the windshield shatter as they hit the concrete. But his senses weren't sharp enough to control what happened next. Caleb passed out cold. It was 3 hours before the ambulance came to take him away. The next thing he knew was in a hospital room awaiting the doctor's examination results. His head was aching, but he had not been badly injured. As he sat on the edge of his hospital bed, he could hear the doctor asking questions. There was a nurse giving answers after each question was asked. "Time of arrival?" the doctor asked. 2:18 a.m. Thursday, the nurse replied. "Mark down room 404 as being occupied by one Mrs. Nancy Rellie." Caleb hadn't really been sure what day it was, but now the evening's activities were becoming clearer. He vaguely recalled last night in the restaurant. The sound of his car tires squealing began ringing in his ears, bringing back to him that they had been in an accident. He looked up from his stupor and asked to anyone who might have heard him, "Please, where is my wife, Nancy Rellie?" Still not being able to focus on who was in the room, he heard a voice reply to him, "She is right here, Mr. Rellie, next to you. You have been in and out of consciousness, but we have checked all your vitals and they are stable. You are free to go as you please. However, your wife is going to have to stay for further observation. That bed that you are sitting on is not going to be used for the next couple of days by another patient that we know of. So you are free to sleep there with her here in the room if you prefer." Caleb rubbed his eyes and could see clearly now that his wife was indeed lying in the bed next to him. It was a singular-looking bed with iron rails and pale green sheets. Each bed had a side table with a telephone on it. With a faint awareness of others still being in the room, he got up from his hospital bed and walked over to her. "Nancy, it's me, Cal. Can you hear me? Kick, please, honey, answer me." He held her hand in his and waited, watching for any sign that she might reply, but she didn't even flinch. "I'm sorry to inform you, Mr. Rellie, but your wife Nancy is suffering from a comatose state. It seems the shock of your car wreck may have caused her to have minor cerebral damage. We are monitoring all of her vitals, and will keep you informed as to any changes in her condition." Caleb was in shock at what he was hearing. Still staring at Nancy with her limp hand held in his, he asked, "How long before she will wake up again?" "It's difficult to say. Some patients with her same condition are more serious than others. There have been some patients known to wake up after only a few hours, others days, or sometimes they remain in this state. He paused slightly before continuing, maybe even indefinitely. When will you know for sure her actual condition? Asked Caleb, looking at Nancy laying there. So far, she has not spontaneously opened her eyes or given us any response to questions asked. Expansion of the pupils and respiratory pattern are also important, and her condition in these areas seems hopeful. Causes of coma are often diagnosed from blood work and analysis of her urine to evaluate blood chemistry, drug screen, and blood cell abnormalities that may indicate collaborative causes in addition to any impact trauma. We may also choose to diagnose from a CT or MRI scan. We are checking to see what is allowed by your insurance before carrying on with any tests that may be deemed necessary, the doctor stated. Just do whatever you need to get her better, and I'll figure out a way to pay for it, Caleb shot back. Caleb, now fully aware how grave the situation was, felt his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. His wife looked very pale and quiet. Kik was rarely quiet. She always knew how to handle situations like this. Now it was up to Caleb to try and stay in control. We'll have the director of our payments department come in and speak with you about all that. Just try to focus on her care and the rest will fall into place. It will be important for her to have someone close to her here at all times in case she does wake up. Do you have any family or friends who might join you here in watching over her? Caleb's voice trembled slightly as he responded, I don't know. Her parents are older and they live out of town. My parents are no longer living. We both work full-time and our close friends have jobs and families. I'm sure I'll be able to take the time off that I need to care for her. Don't worry, I'll make sure I'm here every step of the way. That's very good of you, Mr. Rellie. The doctor didn't seem to believe Mr. Rellie had the necessary stamina to meet the task at hand. We understand that at a time like this, it may be hard to stay focused. But if you feel you are up to the task, we will keep you as involved as we can. No doubt this will help greatly in her recovery. The thought of Nancy being in a coma and needing to recover, as the doctor had put it, sent Caleb's head down on the bed next to her hand. Soft tears rolled down his cheeks, and he couldn't utter another word. The doctor lifted her chart and before walking out of the room said, We'll give you some time alone. Your help with her will be very important. If you need anything, just ring the nursing staff and they can assist you. You can use either this button connected to her hospital bed, or you can dial the red button on this phone. He picked up the receiver to show Caleb where the phone was located. With a professional-looking smile, he walked out of the room. Caleb kept his head on Nancy's arm for some time, trying to wrap his head around the things leading up to the accident. When Caleb finally looked up again, he squinted, due to all the light in the room. The hospital room seemed a blinding, stark white. White tile, white walls, and a white drop ceiling made the room very bright and almost painful to his eyes. No wonder people think they see a bright light before dying, he thought dourly to himself. He got up and walked across the room to where a white cushioned metal chair sat near the window looking outside. He sat down firmly on it, noticing that certain body parts were sore, probably from the accident. He had a strange tingling sensation underneath his right foot and began rubbing it while he gazed out the window. Caleb wondered if the brightness in the room might cause his wife to awake from her coma. It had been some time since he had seen his wife sick. She was always the pillar of strength. Kik made sure to take care of herself despite their busy schedule. Her long chestnut hair was always flat ironed. Her makeup was never overdone, but highlighted the brightness in her eyes ever so slightly. As Caleb sat there staring at his wife of 3 years, he wondered if he would ever get to see those bright eyes again. Walking up to her bedside, he took out a comb from his pocket and began to comb her bangs to one side just the way he knew she always liked it. As he was about to go into her purse and look for her favorite lip gloss, the doctor appeared again. Caleb looked at the clock and was surprised that a couple hours had passed. It seemed as if it had only been minutes. "Good afternoon, doctor. Thank you for coming," said Caleb warmly, extending his hand. The doctor did not take his hand, but went over to the bed and began doing an examination including eye checks, heart monitoring, and looking closely at Nancy's fingernails. The doctor continued to examine Nancy in what Caleb assumed to be standard procedure. A tall nurse with red hair was standing behind him taking notes as he spoke. The patient is now in an official comatose state. She has failed to respond to stimuli, sound, and light. The accident looks to have caused injury in the cerebral cortex. What does that mean? Interrupted Caleb. Is she going to die? Is she going to wake up? Further examination will be necessary in order to determine her condition. The doctor answered his question in an odd way, in Caleb's opinion, while continuing the examination, never looking up at Caleb directly. He was poking Nancy's left foot with a sharp device to see if she would respond. Coma is a medical emergency, and attention must first be directed to maintaining the patient's respiration and circulation, using ventilation, administration of intravenous fluids as needed, and other supportive care. It is extremely important for a physician to determine quickly the cause of a coma, so that potentially reversible conditions are treated immediately. He then continued with more statements of diagnosis, speaking more to the nurse than to Caleb. Caleb felt at this time it would make sense to let the doctor know what led up to the accident. Doctor, my wife and I were in an accident. I had a few glasses of wine before we left the restaurant that night, and now here we are at the hospital. It might be helpful if we could look at the police report and compare what was written with your own findings. Caleb thought this piece of information might be helpful, but the doctor, looking very uninterested and still not making any eye contact with Caleb, continued to speak aloud as the nurse typed down everything he was saying in a computer that sat on a rollaway cart. The patient does not appear to be in a permanent state of coma. Her body temperature is not at a dangerous level. There is no need to fear the worst. With that, he poked his metal tool into her right foot. Caleb began to pace the floor nervously, feeling very uncomfortable. He decided to sit down and elevate his feet as the doctor carried on, hoping that the burning sensation that had taken over his body would end if he lifted his feet above his heart. He did not want to distract the doctor from caring for Nancy by bringing up any unusual symptoms he was experiencing. The doctor paused and spoke to Caleb, who was now looking quite silly with one foot raised on a fern pot and the other foot sitting too high on top of the windowsill next to him. Depending on the length of the coma, the patient may have a different recovery time. In some cases, there is post-traumatic amnesia. So does that mean you think she will wake up? Asked Caleb with a voice filled with hope. He was still sitting in the metal chair awkwardly with his foot up on the fern. The doctor again did not respond to Caleb's question but continued his examination. Caleb could feel his blood pressure rising at the lack of communication he was experiencing from the doctor. As he was about to stand up and demand the doctor's attention, Nancy's right foot jutted up in the air, hitting the doctor square in the jaw. The foot landed back down on the bed soundly, leaving the doctor to stand there and rub his jaw with the care of a mother who comforts her young child after they've scraped a knee. As he watched, the sun shone brightly in his eyes, as if the beams of light went directly into his pupils. He tried to cover his eyes with his forearm, but it was of no use. The sun was making one last vain attempt to stay up before setting in the west. One last shout out to the world that it would not be the last time it shone on mankind. It stood bright orange against the background of the blue sky. Blinded by its glare, Caleb closed the window shade for fear the temperature of the room was too warm for Nancy. By the second day of Nancy's coma, Nancy's condition did not seem to be improving. Her color and statistics were good. Nothing had declined. Yet she was still not waking up and had made no other spontaneous movements as she did that first day. Caleb began to speak to her normally as he would have every day. He started by talking in the way they would when they would go and sit in the coffee shops on Saturdays after their morning of doing household chores. Nancy, the grass is so green from the rain last night. It seems I'll have to cut it twice this week. Then Caleb would pause as if waiting for her to respond. Mrs. Jensen next door will probably help water our flowers since we're spending so much time here at the hospital. The night nurse scares me. He looks just like your Aunt Mildred, only with a beard. Wait. Aunt Mildred did have a beard. Maybe that's why I think they look alike. And so, he kept the conversation going. He would speak, and she would not respond. Often, as he spoke, his attention would turn to her right foot, praying for another movement to give him hope that her sedentary state would soon end. In between little chats, he would tuck her in or massage her legs to make sure she was getting good circulation. By day 3, visitors started to come. Often when they came and went, Caleb had been out of the room. Nancy's mother and father had flown in. They both seemed very grave when they entered the room. Caleb could feel their eyes looking at him in cynical judgment. He didn't say much as one of the nurses had entered and was willing to update them on her situation. They said they could not stay, but wanted to see how she was doing with their own eyes. Nancy's younger brother and his wife came while Caleb had been sleeping. Caleb's parents had died when he was a young boy due to a car accident. There weren't many who would have come to see him personally. Most of the visitors were all Nancy's friends or family. Caleb decided to make himself busy while he waited for more visitors to come. He began straightening up the hospital room, folding Nancy's clothes, wiping down the tables, and throwing out the coffee cups people had left when they came to visit. The scent of citrus perfume filled the air, and he knew who had entered. "Well, what do we have here? Is my favorite student a little down in the dumps?" It was Mrs. Bacon, Caleb's second-grade teacher. She was tall, with bleached blonde hair and too much makeup. Her face was stern as she spoke, as if this new situation might be similar to a student who showed up tardy for class. He was grateful to have had someone who wanted to come and see him because the days in the hospital room had been very lonely. "What a predicament you have found yourself in, Caleb. Tell me, my dear, was it your fault?" Mrs. Bacon seemed to be asking the most horrific questions, and yet Caleb was not shocked. He looked at Nancy, and then Mrs. Bacon, who was standing near Nancy's bed. He looked at his former teacher, staring at him, waiting for a response, and said, "I don't know." "I think you had better find out, Caleb Rellie." She was now holding her hands on her hips and pointing one index finger at him as she spoke. "You know the police will be involved, and if you don't have your story straight, you might go to jail. And if you go to jail, you may never see your wife again. If she wakes up, she won't know where you are or what they've done with you because there will be no one there to tell her. So think, Caleb, before you do anything else, more than you've ever thought before. What is it that happened that night?" Without really finishing the conversation, Miss Bacon left. With her, left the scent of citrus, which had always left Caleb feeling calm despite the fact that she was a little cynical. She had been his teacher the year his parents were killed in the car accident. Ever since, she would keep tabs on him, sometimes taking the bus just to see how he was doing. When he and Nancy were married, she attended the wedding. And each year around the time of the new school year, Caleb would make sure to take her the brightest, shiniest apple he could find. Mrs. Bacon came several times during the course of Nancy's hospitalization, always first thing in the morning. Caleb got up and peered out of the hospital window to watch her walk off the property before saying to Nancy, "She's always a bit of an old bat, isn't she?" He could hear more footsteps coming down the hallway. When they neared their doorway, they stopped, seeming to pause, and then entered. "Hello there, Nancy. What has happened to you?" A strange-looking fellow, wearing loud shoes that made an echoing sound on the tile as he walked, came into the room and approached Nancy's bed. Caleb got up to shake his hand, but the man went over to the bed and continued to speak to Nancy as if he wasn't even aware of Caleb's presence. "We're going to have to do something about this situation, aren't we?" he said, putting his hand on top of hers. "Don't you worry about a thing. I've got everything under control, Nancy. We're going to take care of him." "Take care of whom?" Caleb asked, as he looked at the man in shock. He didn't recognize his face at all. Before he could ask for the man's name, he vanished. Looking down at Nancy and scratching his head, he said in a low tone to her, "You never cease to amaze me, Kick. You sure know a lot of people, but good old Cal will be the one taking care of you and not that guy." With that, he laughed aloud, not really understanding what had just happened, but happy to have something new to say to her fragile form as she lay there. The day nurse came in with an armful of books. She was a tiny, thin person of about 25. Her wispy blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail and seemed to drop a strand of hair with each step she took. Although she had worked in several suburban clinics, this was her first hospital job, and she intended to be the best nurse she could be. "I thought you might like to read these. Some family members even enjoy reading books out loud so that the patient can hear, although there has never been documented proof that the practice actually aids in the patient's recovery process." "Gee, thanks. Do I need to pick out which one I want?" He asked this not knowing what kind of book he would like to read to Nancy, as he wasn't really much of a reader, but the idea sounded like a great way to pass the time. "Oh no, you can have them all, and when you are finished, you can return them to the library located on the second floor. Do you know where that is?" The nurse wasn't looking at Caleb as she spoke, but checking the computer monitor for Nancy's latest vitals. "I think I'll manage to find my way. Thank you for thinking of us," he said gratefully. "You're very welcome. Reading helps ease the mind, and the mind can make us anxious in times like these, so just try to relax, and I'm sure in no time everything will be all right." The nurse walked out just as fast as she had walked in. "Finally," Caleb thought to himself, "a person with an ounce of bedside manner." Caleb began to look through the pile of books. There was Wuthering Heights, which had been a favorite movie of his mother. Then there were some mystery suspense novels that he thought he might enjoy. Lastly, there were 2 romantic stories, which he thought Nancy might like, but he felt embarrassed to read them aloud if people were to walk in the room. Having chosen one of the mystery novels, he decided to sit down and begin reading it to her right away. The storyline was about a man who was a detective. Upon investigating a murder case, he discovers a conspiracy. Caleb began to read to Nancy around dinner time, and was surprised when he finished the 3rd chapter, and it had become dark outside. Caleb put the book down and sat there. He began to try and think about his work schedule next week and wondered what he would do if Nancy still didn't wake up in time for that business merger he was organizing. There was another worker in the office named Larry, who would gladly help him out. In fact, he would help him right out of a job, since he was always trying to undermine everything Caleb did in the office in hopes of getting a higher position. But Caleb figured if all else failed, it would be in the company's best interests to have Larry do the merger. He decided he would wait a couple more days before making the dreaded call informing his boss that he wouldn't be able to handle it. Suddenly, as he was thinking about work, Nancy made a groan and raised her right arm slightly. "Nancy! Kick! I'm here! It's me, Caleb!" Caleb ran over to the bed, pushed the nurse's button, and then held Nancy's hand, stroking it in hopes that she would come to consciousness again. One of the night nurses soon entered the room. "You called?" she asked, with something in her hand, as if she had been in the middle of doing something when he pushed the button. "Yes. It's my wife. I heard her make a noise. I think she's coming to. What should we do?" Caleb said this all very excitedly. He began shaking Nancy's hand in hopes that it would help her come out of the coma. The nurse took her hand out of his and put her own hand on Caleb's shoulder in a patronizing manner. "Maybe it would be better if you waited over there, Mr. Rellie. I am going to ring for the doctor, and I promise not to leave her side if she comes to consciousness. Things like this often happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean that she'll wake up yet. But we will do all that we can to make it happen one day, even if she's not ready just now." The nurse checked Nancy's eyes and pulse, but saw no sign of further response. "Thank you, nurse," said Caleb in a whisper. He felt the pain of deflated hope. With his heart still racing over the excitement, he got up and walked over to the chair in the corner of the hospital room. Caleb sat down in the chair and must have fallen asleep because by the time he woke up again, it was already morning. The room was filled with sunlight, and there lay his precious wife, with no sign of her old self yet present. Being very disappointed in himself that he could sleep when something so important was happening, he decided to go get a cup of coffee to wake up. The usual coffee machine that was near her hospital room was broken. He could tell something wasn't right as the smell of burnt coffee permeated the hall. He shook the coffee pot to see if there was any left, but the coffee left on the bottom was now dry and crusty. "There is another machine near the nurse's station," he heard a voice call out to him. He turned, but they must have already left, because there weren't any people standing near enough to Caleb to be the one that spoke to him. He walked down the hallway, asked someone where the machine was located, and then went in the direction pointed. As he turned the corner expecting to come upon the coffee machine, he heard the familiar sound of noisy shoes. Then there was another voice that began speaking to the man with the noisy shoes, causing Caleb to stop at the corner and listen. "The condition is just as we expected it to be. The accident must be investigated further, but it will be impossible to get the man to talk and tell us what we want to know." I think we should continue administering the medicines so that he can stay calm and we can try to get the wife to cooperate. It's still possible we can protect the interests of all parties involved, at least the ones that truly matter anyway. Yes, Doctor, of course. But how do you think we can go about doing this? They are not likely to comply with our wishes. Try to get the body out of the room and then we can handle the situation to our liking. What room number is it again, Doctor? Room number 404. Caleb had a lump in the middle of his throat. That was Nancy's room. What did they mean they were going to try and move her from the room? The voices continued to speak. He's got the paper in his briefcase. If we can obtain the information we need, then we'll be able to destroy the company's plans. Just leave it to me, I'll take care of him. Caleb tried to lean over as far as he could without being seen. All he could see was a man holding a sharp-looking operating knife in his left hand. He was wearing a white office coat, and in the pocket looked to be a syringe. He raised his thick hand to the needle and tapped it while smiling silently at the one he was speaking to. Caleb couldn't lean over far enough to see which one of these was the man with the noisy shoes, or to make out either of their faces. He leaned just 1 inch more and knocked over a paper that had been taped to the wall where he had been leaning. Caleb ran off in the opposite direction, turning sharply down a stairway exit, so that if they had heard him, they wouldn't see him as he made his escape. Caleb had forgotten about his much-needed coffee. All he could think of was how to get back to his wife. He ran past the nurse's station on the floor below and made his way to the opposite end of the hallway. As was the case on any of the days before that he had set off to explore the building, there was hardly any staff on hand to help him. He saw another stairwell at the opposite end of the building and ran up that. When he got to room 404, he could feel that the shirt he was still wearing since he had first arrived was soaked with sweat from running, but he was relieved to see that Nancy was in her bed, still in a coma. No one had entered the room since he had left that he could tell. Tired from the morning's activities, he decided to sit on the hospital bed next to Nancy and think about what he should do about the conversation he had just overheard. Surely I must have misunderstood, he thought to himself, while at the same time wondering what exactly it was that the two strange voices had been talking about in the coffee room. As Caleb sat chewing on his nails thinking, his friend Larry from work appeared. "Hey buddy, how's it going?" Larry was a middle-aged man much like Caleb, only instead of being clean-shaven, he sported a goat tee on his chin that made him look like he was trying to be a rock star. In reality, Larry was an account broker, and the most exciting roadside venture he ever took was his trip to Vegas to do one of the casino's accounting records. "It's not going so good, Larry. I don't trust this hospital. There are some strange people I have overheard speaking recently, and I don't know what to do about it." Caleb then went on to relate the details of the conversation he had heard and awaited Larry's response on what he should do. Larry had a soft drink in his hand and would intermittently slurp on it as Caleb spoke. Caleb always had found Larry's lack of etiquette and poor listening skills to be annoying, but he decided not to criticize the only ally he had under the circumstances. Larry's eyes were straying around the room. "Are you finding time to read amidst all of this trouble you've found yourself in?" Larry asked, as if amused. "The nurse brought it in and said it might calm my mind." "What's it about?" Larry asked, picking up the book and thumbing through it. "It's about a guy with a scruffy-looking coworker friend who is a lousy listener." Caleb grabbed the book from Larry's hand and flung it on the floor. Larry got up, trying to remain calm. "Look, buddy, I know this is a hard time for you, and I'm here for you. All I'm saying is, maybe your imagination is getting the best of you. You know, you're overtired, you're reading these mystery novels, and now you're coming up with conspiracy theories. It's a hospital for crying out loud, not the CIA headquarters. Just calm down and try to relax. Do you want me to speak with the doctor about getting you some sort of tranquilizers or something to help you stay calm?" "No, I don't want anything. I'll be fine. Thanks for coming." Not really buying into the fact that he was being paranoid, Caleb began subtle attempts to put his friend's mind at ease in order to get him out of the room. "Thanks again for coming in to see me, Larry. You're right. I think I am overtired. Ever since Kick went under, I just can't stop thinking about that night and everything that happened. Did you know the police haven't come to make a report yet?" "I was thinking by now they would have. I had some wine that night, and I'm worried that maybe it could have affected my driving." Larry picked up the book from the floor and put it by the nightstand that stood in between Nancy and Caleb's bed. "Look, pal, I wouldn't go dragging the police into this if you don't have to. Just concentrate on getting better, and then the rest will take care of itself later. I'm not the one that needs to get better. Nancy does." Caleb looked over at her longingly, realizing now more than ever before that she was always his sole confidant, and that no one else could compare to her way of calming him down. "Well, you know what I meant," Larry replied. He had a grim look on his face as he realized there was really no word of comfort he was going to be able to offer. "Cal, I want you to call me if you would like me to stay overnight here with you, okay? Do you still have your cell phone after the accident? I haven't found it and keep forgetting to ask the nurses about it. It's probably still in the car." Larry took his leather wallet out of his back pocket, opened it, and pulled out a business card. He looked down on the hospital floor and noticed a pencil that someone had dropped. Larry picked it up and wrote a number on the back of the card. He handed it to Caleb, who then held it in his hand, reading over the number. "There is my personal cell phone number, Cal. Keep it on you at all times and don't hesitate to call me, buddy. You shouldn't be alone in a time like this." "Thanks, I'll be just fine. Don't you worry about me. Sorry if I scared you with all of that crazy talk." "No problem. That's what friends are for, right?" Larry gave Caleb a solid pat on the shoulder and stuck the pencil behind his ear. "You'll be back to work in no time. Nothing's going to change while you're away." He then walked out of the room. Caleb hadn't realized how tired the day's activities must have made him, and he began to doze off. The hospital lights were dim when Caleb awoke from his sleep. There was no sound of footsteps in the hallway, as there had been when he was last conscious. He could only hear the sound of a whirling machine in the background. He woke up with a thick headache sitting squarely in the middle of his forehead. His neck must have been out of alignment because it felt pinched and stiff, as if he had been in the same position for days. Putting his fingers through his now thick, oily hair, he decided it might be best to take a shower. Not having a change of clothes, and it now being too late to run out and buy some, Caleb found the hospital robe that he must have worn upon arriving, and used that. The shower made him feel fresh and renewed. When he got out, the tile floor was cold against his sockless feet. He tiptoed past the hospital beds and decided to put on his old socks until he could get some new ones from home in the morning. He looked over at Nancy for any sign of life. Only her chest gently moved up and down. She looked so peaceful, he thought to himself as he picked up a towel and a hospital robe. The tile floor was cold underneath his feet, but in his sleepy stupor he decided not to disturb Nancy by wearing his flip-flops. Only afterwards, when he walked past her the second time, did he realize just how silly it was to try not to disturb a comatose person. In fact, he wondered if he shouldn't disturb her. Looking to either side of the room, just in case someone was entering, Caleb gently gave Nancy's left leg a pinch. When this didn't work, he gave it a harder pinch. He was just about to pinch one more time when the phone rang and he picked it up. "Hello?" There was no answer on the other end. Then the sudden click and dial tone as the call ended made Caleb jump. All the thoughts of what had happened the night before and what he had heard in the hospital hallway came flooding back into his mind. Now, swimming with paranoia, he put the receiver down slowly, glanced over at Nancy, and let out a heavy sigh. Caleb decided to go to the nurse's station and see if it had been someone attempting to call him. He turned the corner at the end of the ward and thought he might call Larry for advice, or explain to him in more detail of what he had heard the day before. Really, he just wanted someone to talk to. But when he arrived at the waiting room and went to make a call, there was no reception. He took the elevator down to the second floor and attempted to make another phone call, but to no avail. Not wanting to leave Nancy for too long in case the nursing staff came in to move her, he decided to go back upstairs and check on how Nancy was doing. He figured if he checked on her first, then he could go outside the hospital and make his phone call from the parking lot. Upon entering the room, Nancy was gone. Caleb could feel the rush of panic wash over him, causing his heart to race. Where could they have taken her? Why would they take her without having consulted with him first? Who took her? Was it the man with the noisy shoes? He ran out of the room to find some nurses, but no one was at their stations. The perspiration was now beginning to form on his forehead. The doors whizzing by him as he ran began to make him feel dizzy. He took a right at the first exit sign that he saw and ran down the staircase, flying around the corners in one leap. He pushed the door open with both hands and went right again, remembering this was the closest exit near to where he had parked his car. When he finally reached the door, he slammed into it as if he didn't know he had to open it first. Having fallen on his back flatly, a nurse came running up to help him. "Sir, do you need help? Are you sick?" she asked, leaning over him, checking his eyes. "No, I am fine," he groaned, still in pain from the fall. "I just tried to exit the building and the door must have been locked." "I don't think you actually got to the opening the door part, sir. Here, let me have your hand. I'll help you back to your room. Which room number are you in?" 404 is my wife's room number. I entered the room only to find that she was missing. I need help. Someone has taken her and I don't know what to do. Caleb realized that all of this sounded very desperate and unrealistic, but he couldn't stop himself from uttering the words. The nurse walked with him to the elevator, and they both entered in. He felt himself becoming increasingly paranoid about being alone with her there. As the elevator lights counted up the floor numbers, they slowly entered the room together. There lay Nancy in her bed. "I don't understand. She was gone and now she's here." Caleb looked around and the nurse was gone. Kik lay there so still, so unassuming as always, like an angel. Caleb didn't know what he should do. If he left, they might come and move her again. On the other hand, had she really been moved at all? Was he losing his mind? What was happening? Either Nancy really was in some sort of danger, or he was going insane. Caleb checked every bone of her body to make sure she was all right. It seemed as if not even so much as a sheet had been moved. He finally decided that maybe he was overtired and that he must have imagined the entire thing. All he could do was stand over her like a guardian, watching every movement of her chest as it gently rose and fell. There was a rhythm to it. Never did she gasp for air, and never did it pause. If only she could open her eyes and speak to him, telling him that everything was going to be okay. Then maybe he could find it in himself to fall asleep. But what if he was right, and someone really was trying to move Nancy? Such disquieting thoughts kept creeping back into his mind the minute he attempted to calm himself down. Fearing that he was starting to lose his mind, Caleb decided it might be best to call the nurse's station and ask about a sleep aid. When he picked up the receiving end of the telephone, a man was on the other end. "Caleb, are you listening?" The man's voice sounded muted, distorting it and making it unrecognizable. "Listen to what we tell you to do and you won't get hurt. You have papers in your briefcase and we need them, Caleb. We have shown you what can happen if you don't listen. It will be very easy to alter your life in a way that is much more drastic than what you have experienced over the last couple of days. All you need to do is what we tell you and your wife will not get hurt." "I don't understand what it is you want me to do." Caleb was speaking very loudly, hoping that someone would hear him. He also grabbed the button attached to the hospital bed and began to press it for help. "Take the papers in your briefcase to the first floor of the hospital building. When you reach the basement stairs, go down them. At the bottom of the stairs, you will see a metal box. Open it, Caleb, and put the merger papers inside. Leave the box and leave the hospital. If you do as you are instructed, I promise that you and your wife will be left alive." Caleb's heart began to beat like the sound of a drum before battle. He scanned the room for his briefcase, which he had not taken notice of since before they had been in the Italian restaurant the night of the accident. After looking under Nancy's table, bed, and the metal chair by the window, Caleb saw it. It must have been sitting there underneath his hospital bed the entire time. Caleb ran over to the bed, kneeled down on the tile floor, and grabbed the case. He got up and left the hospital room, turning to the right, accessing the closest stairwell to the room. Caleb, with his hospital robe still on and the briefcase in hand, leapt down the stairwell, taking the stairs in 2s and 3s. Upon reaching the bottom step, he did not see the metal box that the strange man spoke of. "It must be at the other end of the hallway where I was earlier," Caleb thought to himself. He went back up one flight of stairs so he could go back down the opposite hallway that would take him to the other basement stairs, since there was no tunnel that led to both ends. The only thing between the two stairwells was the hospital morgue, and the access doors were securely locked. The hallway lights were dim and oppressive. The fluorescent bulbs flickered as if ready to burn out. He was about to pass a visitor's room on his right when he heard voices and decided to stop and listen to be sure it wasn't someone who would try and stop him from delivering the papers. There was a corner mirror opposite the room, and he could see a thin-looking man with a large mustache was standing at the corner of the visitor's room entrance. He had something in his hand that looked like a paper bag. Caleb couldn't know that the syringes inside were filled with a sedative intended to keep him asleep for a very long time. However, his intuition, or possibly his paranoia, screamed that these men meant him no good. Despite thinking he had a good hiding spot, the man turned in time to see Caleb's reflection in the mirror opposite the room. Caleb gasped in horror as he saw the reflection of the man in the mirror moving slowly against the wall and towards the visitor room entranceway. The man was reaching into his paper bag for one of the needles as he slowly crept to meet Caleb at the door. Caleb decided to back up and go the other way slowly while still watching the reflection in the mirror, hoping that the man would assume he was a hospital patient. As Caleb continued walking backwards, the strange-looking man slowly stepped forward. He noticed the man's eyes watching him in the mirror with every step he took. It made him nervous to the point that his brow began to bead with sweat. He reached into his jacket pocket to search for Larry's phone number, but since he was still wearing his hospital robe, he had no pocket and therefore no phone number. Not having time to go back to the hospital room, he took off as fast as he could down the hallway. "Run, Caleb, run! They're after you," he thought to himself as he turned and whizzed past the nurse's station, not seeing anyone there that might be of assistance to him. The man in the mirror began to run quickly behind him and yell, "Stop! Don't get hysterical!" He extended his arm to Caleb as if trying to grab him and halt the chase. Caleb opened the door to the stairwell and shouted out behind him as he began to leap down the stairs. "Hysterical is for people who don't have a plan. I've got one and you're not going to get it." In reality, Caleb had no plan. His plan was to run out of the hospital and find help as fast as he possibly could. When he reached the end of the hallway on the floor above where he had just been, he realized the hospital doors were locked tight. "The nurse's station is my only hope," he thought as he ran in the opposite direction of the hallway he had just been in, down and towards the nurse's station that would have a telephone where he could call the police for help. Caleb ran to the next nurse's station, nearest the hospital exits. He saw the telephone sitting there and picked up the receiver to call for help. Before he could finish dialing, a man's hand grabbed onto his wrist in a deathly tight grip and banged it several times on the desk, causing the phone receiver to fall from his hand. Caleb let out a cry for help, but the man tried to muffle him with his free hand, still holding on to Caleb's wrist. Caleb picked up the stapler that was sitting on top of the nurse's station and bashed the man over the head with it. The man dropped to the ground and lay there in a heap. Caleb kneeled down in his robe and bare feet and began to search through the man's pockets for anything that might give him a clue as to who the man was. But he found nothing but a key sitting on a chain that was around the man's neck. The man groaned, moving his arm, and in a jerk reaction, Caleb took the pencil that was still sitting behind his ear and plunged it into the man's hand between his thumb and forefinger, leaving the pencil there. The man screamed in shock and pain and then attempted to jump up, but lost his footing and instead fell backwards, hitting his head on the tile floor, knocking himself unconscious. When Caleb saw that he was making no further attempts to move, he dragged the man to the nurse's station desk. Caleb grunted and panted as he dragged the heavy weight as fast as he could. Grabbing some masking tape, Caleb began tying up the man's wrists and ankles. Finding no other place that seemed stable enough to hold him, Caleb taped the man up to the nurse's desk until he could call for help. He carefully unhooked the chain holding the key from the man's neck and placed it around his own. He picked up the phone receiver again, only to find the line had been cut. Caleb knew that he had no time to waste. He had to get Nancy out of the hospital, and then maybe someone could help them both. He ran up the flight of stairs to her room. Nancy's bed was there, but she was not in it. It sat there empty. The phone on the table next to her bed rang suddenly. Caleb slowly picked up the receiver, and before it could reach his ear, he heard the familiar voice from the last phone call. He said, "We have her. You did not do as we instructed you to do. If you want to see your wife alive, we suggest you cut out the funny business and do what we have asked of you." Click. The call had ended. Caleb did everything he could not to break down and cry right there. He stared at the crumpled up pieces of paper in his hand. He had never even gotten close enough to any metal box to put the merger papers inside. He then looked down at his chest, at the key that was on the chain hanging around his neck. A key to where? He wondered. Could it be the key to the room where they had Nancy? The only other place that he could think of was the storage rooms in the basement where the morgue was located. If he could make it in time, he could place the merger paper in the box and then go try to find Nancy there and get her out of the hospital to find help. Filled with the energy of a man on the run, Caleb ran down the hospital corridor and down the steps to the first floor to reach the basement stairwell. He passed the same area where he had hit the man with a stapler, only the body was gone. He kept running and entered the stairwell of the hospital located at the far end of the hallway. Caleb leaped down the stairs, barely making contact with the steps. When he reached the bottom, the metal box was sitting at the end of the stairwell as promised. Next to it was the doorway leading to the storage room where he thought they may have hidden Nancy. Caleb opened the doorknob with both hands, swinging it open hard and causing it to hit the wall behind it with a loud bang. As he entered, he could hear the sound of the man with noisy shoes coming rapidly behind him down the stairs. Caleb looked for something that he might use to be able to block the doorway. Maybe the man would only want the paper and then would release Kick in exchange. But what if he wants the papers and then just decides to kill us both, because we know too much? Not knowing what to do next, Caleb tried to focus on finding Nancy. But the sound of the man's footsteps was ringing in his ears. Caleb saw a tall metal filing cabinet and began pushing it towards the door. As he gave a final push, blocking the door, the man with the noisy shoes slammed into the door's opposite side. He began to shove against it, trying to open it, but he couldn't. Caleb ran in the other direction to the sounds of the man banging and pushing on the door, trying to get in. He knew the simple blockade would only hold for a matter of minutes at best. As Caleb ran down the dark corridor in search of Nancy, he tried to drown out the sound of the man hitting the file cabinet with the door. The sound in his ears changed from that of the banging of metal to that of a sloshing noise. Caleb looked down and the floor was filled with water as if a pipe had broken. The water was rushing down towards a set of double doors that must have led to the morgue. The doors were locked. Anxious to get inside, as he was sure that's where they were hiding Nancy, Caleb began searching for something to break the double doors' glass windows with. There were old computer monitors sitting on a table nearby. Caleb ran over to the table, splashing water with every step, and picked up the heaviest monitor he could find. With one huge throw, he sent the computer monitor crashing into the glass. It fell apart into pieces onto the watery floor below. The glass looked unharmed. Caleb grabbed a second monitor, this time running up to the glass, trying to use his body weight to force the monitor through. His body crashed into the window with full force, causing some glass shards from the monitor to embed themselves into his chest. Looking down at his chest, he saw the key sitting around his neck on a chain. That was it! Caleb ripped the key off of his neck and began trying to wiggle it in the keyhole. The door opened, but as he entered the room, he slipped on the wet tiles and fell to the floor on the other side of the doorway. His body landed flat on the ground, and his clothes were instantly soaked. He stood himself up, but the force of the water was now stronger than before. Using the floor for leverage, he shifted his body weight from one foot to the other as he stood upright. The water was rushing over his calves now, and it was becoming hard to stand up straight. This part of the basement had no sign of windows, but only other doors that led to other hallways of the hospital. There were panels in the walls around him, and he assumed that he was in the morgue where the bodies were stored. Caleb ran to the opposite end where another locked door stood waiting. His key wasn't working on that door, and he feared that he had reached a dead end to his search. Turning to the right, he ran towards a storeroom. Several rolling cots were in the way, and he pushed them over, knocking them into a metal examination table nearby. Grabbing the key once again, he began to jiggle it into the keyhole. After 2 attempts, the key broke off. Caleb beat his fists against the door and screamed, "No!" The water in the on this floor was rising. Faintly, he heard a voice inside. Caleb! Caleb! Is that you?" It was Nancy's voice. He could hear her crying, but it was as if she were miles away from him, locked away in the storage room in which he was attempting to open. "Kick! Hang on! I'm coming for you! Hang on!" Caleb kept screaming as he attempted to open the door, but it was of no use. The water had now risen to his thighs, making it very difficult to stand upright. "Caleb! I'm here! I'm here!" Nancy yelled from inside the storeroom. "I'm coming, Nancy! Please don't be afraid! I'm coming for you!" Caleb cried as he kept hitting the door with his fists, hoping that somehow it would miraculously open. He began to bang his head against the door when he thought of an idea. If he could use one of the carts he had pushed over to the side as a battering ram, maybe with all his body weight, he could bash the doors open. Caleb went over to where the carts were. The force of the water made it difficult for him to move as quickly as he wanted. If he could gain enough force between his efforts and the rush of the water, he might just be able to knock the door down. He backed up, feeling the pressure of the water against his calves, but the pressure turned into something much stronger. As if hitting a wall behind him, he stopped as he backed up into something. It was the man who he had hit over the head with the stapler. The man grabbed him by the arm, clasping a pair of handcuffs on him, and began dragging him towards the door that led to where Nancy was being held. Caleb tried to fight, but the weight of the water sent him sinking down to the floor. He was now being dragged by the man with his one good hand. The water was rushing over Caleb's shoulders, and he was taking it in with huge gulps, causing him to sputter and choke. "Now you'll drown right alongside her," screamed the man over the sound of the rushing water. "We have the papers, we have everything we need, and we won't be needing you or that wife of yours any longer." "But I gave you what you wanted. Why don't you just go and leave us alone?" Caleb's cries were of no use. The man was holding an electric device. It looked like paddles, only it wasn't hooked up to any machine. Caleb looked at the paddles in his hand and then looked down at the water rushing underneath him. The man smiled as he immersed the paddles into the water below, sending an electric current surging through the water and soon after, surging through Caleb's body. He felt his body seize up in a fire that coursed through his veins. As he dropped into the water below, he yelled, "Nancy!" "Yes, dear, I'm here!" Caleb looked up to see his wife standing over him as he lay in a hospital bed. They were in room 404. "Where am I?" he said groggily, as if waking up from a Saturday morning sleep-in. "Caleb, you're in the hospital." Nancy leaned into his face so that he could look into her eyes. She was rubbing the hair off his forehead in a calming fashion. "Nancy, what happened? Are you all right? How did you get free?" Nancy looked up at the doctor who was entering the room before she could reply. The doctor was the same one Caleb had seen before, caring for Nancy. Only this time Nancy spoke to him, and he seemed to be replying to her instead of ignoring her, as he had done Caleb. The doctor had a throbbing red-purple bruise on his chin. The doctor then turned his attention to Caleb. "Mr. Rellie, I need you to answer some questions for me. I know you are an intelligent man, but I am going to be asking you a string of questions, and I need you to tell me the answers, whether or not you think the answers to be obvious." As he asked the questions, he poked and prodded at Caleb. He was wearing a large orange stethoscope that had a matching flashlight which he was using to look into Caleb's eyes. The light was blindly bright, and Caleb wondered if he would be able to see clearly after the doctor was finished. The doctor asked, "Are you up to answering a few questions, Mr. Rellie?" "All right, I can do that," Caleb replied. The doctor dropped Caleb's left eyelid and stood over him. He began to ask a series of questions. "What is your name?" "Caleb Rellie." "How old are you?" "I am 34 years old." "How many people do you see in this room, and can you give me their names?" Caleb turned to look at Nancy, and seeing that she was the only other person, replied, "There are only two besides myself. You and my wife Nancy, only I don't know your name." "I'm sorry, my name is Dr. Ledbetter. I have been your doctor for the entire length of your stay here." The doctor smiled at Caleb and began rubbing his bruised chin. "Let's just say you've come out of this kicking and fighting. That's how we like to see it." The doctor stopped rubbing his chin and continued speaking. "You have been in a comatose state for several days. Yesterday your heart stopped beating unexpectedly, and we had to shock your heart back into a regular rhythm. Your lungs were also filling with fluids, which we now seem to have under control. Treatment occurred within 5 minutes, so there should be no risk of permanent brain damage. At this statement, a gasp escaped Nancy's mouth. The doctor looked over at her reassuringly and said, "I realize this is a lot to take in since he's just become fully conscious for the first time in days." The doctor then spoke in the direction of a male nurse who had just entered. The doctor went through several stats and then ended with, "All his vital signs seem to be normal. He has come out of the coma as well as can be expected, but we'll still need to keep him for observation for a day or two." The nurse typed for several minutes further, and then hit the enter button and wheeled the card away. The doctor looked down at Caleb and smiled. "I think you have some catching up to do with your wife, Mr. Rellie. If you have any questions after she's updated you on this week's events, just give me a call. I'm making my rounds now, but I'll be returning in an hour to do a more detailed examination." With that, the doctor walked out of the hospital room, leaving Caleb and Nancy alone. Nancy, who had stood up when the doctor entered, came closer to the bed, taking Caleb's hand into hers. "Oh, my darling, I'm so sorry for what you've been through," Nancy said to Caleb, her eyes on the verge of tears. She sat at the side of the bed. She had retired from brushing the hair off of his brow and was now holding his left hand in hers, rubbing it gently. "It is good to see you again, Kick. But may I ask what exactly is it that I've been through?" Caleb then put her left hand onto the top of her right to help her focus on giving him every detail. "We had an accident, darling. You went into a severe coma. We don't understand what was happening to you the past few days. You would come in and out of it in the strangest ways. At times, when we had visitors, you would respond. Yesterday evening, your lungs filled with fluid. You went into cardiac arrest, and they had to use the crash cart. They attached pads to your chest and shocked you. You whispered my name as you went out again. However, the doctor said you were breathing normally and we had only to wait for you to wake up. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, Caleb. I really thought I was going to lose you." "I know what you mean," was all Caleb could think of to say, as the events he thought had actually happened came back in his mind in vivid pictures. Nancy stopped speaking for fear she would begin to cry. She wanted very badly to be strong for Caleb as he learned what had really happened to him. Nancy and Caleb sat together that night talking about everything. While they spoke, the janitor came in. He was wearing a very noisy pair of shoes. He looked at Nancy and then Caleb and gave them both thumbs up. Then he took a coffee cup from the table next to the bed opposite the one Caleb was in and placed it in the garbage bag he was holding. Nancy got up and shook his hand and said, "Thank you for keeping up with all of my empty coffee cups. It seems I have single-handedly caused a hospital-wide coffee shortage. I'm just happy to be of help." The janitor gave her his wrist instead of hand as he was wearing gloves and thought it might not be clean for her to touch him. He nodded his head again and smiled at both of them, leaving the room with his bag, which sounded like it was filled with hospital papers. This reminded Caleb he himself had some paperwork he needed to tend to. Nancy turned to look at him once again. "My report for work. The papers for the merger. I remember they were due on Monday. I've been here in the hospital, so it couldn't have made it on time." Caleb asked questions as he began to remember some of the things that had happened before the accident. "Actually, honey, at one point you came out of your coma, you began ranting and raving, and the doctors had to restrain you to the hospital bed. But I knew you were not hallucinating. You kept saying, 'I've got to get them the papers.' Nancy, we're finished if I don't give them those papers." The hospital had metal safe boxes in each room to keep important papers. We kept your briefcase in it just in case there was something we needed. When you kept saying this about the paperwork, I looked through the briefcase and found the merger papers. I called your boss at work and he sent Larry, the accountant with the funny beard, in to get them. Larry said he would make sure you got credit for all the work and that you shouldn't worry that you would have some sort of inner office conspiracy on your hands. She laughed at the thought. Now Caleb knew that his conversation with Larry had not been completely based on fantasy. That was nice of him to leave work to do that for me. Well, he said he used it as an excuse to take a soda break, so I don't think he minded much at all. I was happy you had some visitors here for you. My family came, but you were mostly out of consciousness the entire time. I think Larry might have helped remind you that you still had business on this earth to attend to." She gave Caleb a wink, and he winked back at her, acknowledging that part of that must have been true. Caleb looked at his wife with all the admiration he could muster, thinking of how even throughout all her worries, she still managed to care for him in the little ways that he would have needed after he awoke. This made him love her all the more. Nancy looked at him very concerned and said, "Tell me, Caleb, are you hungry?" Caleb thought for a moment and realized that the entire time he had been out and dreaming, or whatever it was that he had been doing, he never once ate, and so should therefore have been very hungry. But he didn't feel hungry at all. "No, honey, I'm not hungry. It must be the IVs they've had me on. I feel just fine." Nancy giggled and said, "Well, you kept saying something about bacon, and then you would carry on talking, so I assumed that you were hungry. There were certain moments when you came in and out of your coma. When this happened, you would say the strangest things. At times when the doctor would come in, it was as if you were attempting to respond to him, but your words were never really clear. Every morning the nursing staff would bring me your tray of food to eat since you couldn't eat it. It was usually something simple like orange juice or sliced grapefruit. I remember thinking how you would have hated it and preferred something like bacon instead. Maybe it was the IVs, although you didn't seem too happy about those either." "What do you mean?" asked Caleb, not understanding her statement. "At one point, as the doctor was administering an IV, you had a spontaneous reaction and grabbed at him in a stabbing motion. He said that if you had actually had something in your hands, he thinks you could have done some damage. In fact, in a reaction to your swinging, he had to take your arm and restrain you to the bed. You can still see a little bit of a bruise from where you fought." She pointed at his wrist. He looked down at it and recalled the incident with the pencil that apparently had been no incident at all, but an unconscious attempt to return to the realm of the living. Caleb, now understanding the length and breadth of what had actually happened, took her hand that was placed very close to his and said, "I need to ask you something about the accident." She looked at him with soft eyes that were filling with tears. "What is it that you want to know, Cal? Was it my fault? I had been drinking wine that night, and I hate the thought that anything I did could have put you in danger." "Actually, you refused to drink that night, dear. Don't you remember? I said that the wine was dry and you called the waiter over to return it. In fact, you grumbled that you couldn't believe you were leaving with an empty glass when you should be celebrating. But you didn't want to risk it since you were driving home." She smiled and patted Caleb's hand as she got up to walk over to the chair next to the window. Caleb felt an instant sigh of relief overcome him. "Well, it's enough to make one never take risks again," Caleb said, looking at her as she sat down. Her eyes looked tired, as if she had been up for days. She still had some scratches from the accident, and he wondered if she was in any pain or if she was feeling sore. The day nurse came in as if wandering. "Hello there. It's so good to see you up and about, Mr. Rellie." She looked at Caleb and smiled as she took some books off his nightstand table. "Well, I haven't really gotten up yet, but I'm thinking that will be my next move, since I've been told that I've overstayed my welcome," Caleb responded cheerfully. "You can never overstay your welcome, Mr. Rellie, but we find that when left with a choice, most people would rather be able to leave the hospital rather than stay." Nancy chimed in, "Thank you for allowing us to read those books." The nurse went over to Nancy and took the one from her extended hand. "Oh, that's no problem at all. Did it help pass the time?" "Oh, yes. I chose one I thought my husband would like. I'm not sure what he got out of it, but I really enjoyed it. Thanks again for all your help." "No problem, Mr. and Mrs. Rellie. If there's anything else you need, just let us know." With her arms full of books, she promptly left the room. Nancy was sitting on the ledge of the window, much as Caleb had remembered doing when he thought she had been lying in the hospital bed. Caleb asked, "What do you see outside the window? Describe it to me." "It's funny you should ask that. I sat here every afternoon and told you what I saw as I looked out the window. I figured maybe you could hear me, and maybe it would help you come back to me. Beyond the hospital gate there is a park and—" "Children are playing," Caleb said with a smile. "Yes, how did you know?" Nancy asked, her eyes brimming with tears. "I have a feeling there's a lot of things that went on these last few days that I might have been aware of." "Were you aware that I was here?" Nancy asked Caleb, searching his eyes for an answer in the affirmative. "Let's just say finding you again was what brought me back, and I'm happy to see the light of day again." Nancy smiled and walked over to the bed, leaning over and kissing Caleb softly on the mouth. Caleb dozed off in a peaceful slumber he hadn't felt for days. The end. This has been a Right On audio presentation of In the Light of Day, a Right On Press feature. We hope you've enjoyed this Right On audio feature presentation. If so, please like, share, and subscribe to receive notifications of all our latest content. And join us again soon for our next Right On audio feature presentation.